Hello, welcome back to the channel, and today's video is going to be about Buddhism. But why? Western society is very inspired and moved by Buddhist, I want to say aesthetics, not necessarily culture, not necessarily beliefs or values, but the aesthetics and the idea of Buddhism, I think, is something that we're seeing more and more of in Western society. Things like fast fashion and home decor, loving in their homes at this point, but not necessarily the next. I think it's kind of fascinating to see quotes from Buddha in people's homes, photos of Buddha in people's homes, little ornaments of Buddha in people's homes. And this video was actually inspired by somebody who was a Buddhist and felt that it was odd to see people in their friendship groups or family who weren't Buddhists, didn't really care for Buddhist culture, didn't know a single thing about Buddha or being Buddhist, yet they had ornaments in their home, a little something like this. I think you've probably seen this in a lot of people's homes, Buddha's head. Why do this with Buddha, which seems like a very odd way of honouring him when we don't do it with Jesus, for instance? We don't cut his head off and put it on our bookshelf. It's a very interesting point, and I think it's a very valid one. So therefore, I wanted to sit down with you guys today and really talk about what it means to be Buddhist. Where did Buddha come from? Who is he? What's his story? How did Buddhism spread across the world? So if you like a little bit of history, if you're interested in knowing the actual origin behind the things that you might put up in your home or might feel a little bit inspired by when you read a few quotes from Buddha himself, let's dive into what it really means and pay a little bit more respect towards that and recognition behind the culture and the religion and get a bit more connected to that side rather than purely aesthetics, trend, the vibe of Buddhism. The faith was actually founded by Siddhartha Gautama more than a whole 2,500 years ago in India. But in short, what does it really mean to be Buddhist? What is it that Buddhists believe? The lovely thing is, to me, is that they don't believe in a god. They don't have anyone who they would call a supreme god. That goes against their belief system, really, in a way. He is someone they would consider a extraordinary being, but not a god. And if anything, Buddhism is a way of life rather than an organized religion. Because the word Buddha itself just means to be enlightened, enlightening oneself. So that religion is basically just about trying to reach that state, that place of peace inside you. And it's not about worshipping a god or seeking an outside source, I guess, for answers or information. It's finding it within. It's going inside yourself instead. Once they reach that space, they experience something called nirvana by utilizing morality, meditation, and wisdom. You know, they receive pieces of information that empowers them as individuals. Anyone watching this video who meditates themselves will understand that the more you meditate, the closer you get to what it is you should know, what you should be doing, your pathway, finding peace in yourself and with other people around you, and just life itself, the struggles that life brings you. I think meditating brings you to a very pure, clear, steady, balanced energy Buddhists would call nirvana. They also believe in karma, which is the law of cause and effect, and also reincarnation, which is an endless cycle of rebirth. But I would say that Buddha's most important teachings are something called the Four Noble Truths. And that will really help you understand what it means to be Buddhist and their faith and their belief systems, but we'll get more into that later on in the video. So today we know Buddhism as the fourth largest religion in the world, but it was actually the first world religion. And while 360 million people follow the way of Buddhism today, over 2,500 years ago, it actually only started with one single man, and that's Siddhartha Gautama. And this man happened to be born into a very wealthy royal family in 520 BC in southern Nepal. So that meant that Siddhartha's dad was king. And one day the king, his dad, went to consult a fortune teller to find out what was in the future for his son. And the fortune teller had actually told Siddhartha's dad, the king, that he was either going to be a king himself or a great sage, and basically a savior of humanity. The king really wanted his son to grow up to be king just like himself, so he basically swore to himself that he would never expose Siddhartha Gautama to any form of ugly truth in which there is out in the world. So he shielded his son in the palace walls and kept him well away from the sick, the elderly, or anything that would inspire him to dedicate his life to religion, and keeping himself from all kinds of people who may have dedicated their lives to spirituality. So this poor boy, this poor man, eventually, he actually turned 21 and was still living in this royal bubble. All he knew was wealth and beauty and the beautiful gardens and healthy young people, and he was fairly content with that, at least for a little while. He married quite early at 16 years old to this beautiful lady, and he trained in the arts of war. But as anyone would at that age, eventually Siddhartha got a little restless and wanted to spread his wings a little bit and do some exploring, see what was beyond the palace walls, see what was out there, see what, actually sat in the kingdom that he owned. And he wanted to see more of the world, more of the people, and he would beg his dad and say, I want to see what's out there, I want to experience more things. And his dad would try and keep him boxed, as he always did. But eventually his dad agreed, give him a little bit of a tour of the capital. But really it was a very restricted, controlled tour that kept Siddhartha only in touch with the young looking, the healthy, even though he could experience a bit more of, the big wide world. His dad, the king, had made it so that the only people that greeted him were very healthy and young and beautiful, and he would take him to areas that he knew wouldn't inspire any of those religious ideas again. But it just so happened that during this tour, two old men had somehow managed to wander too close to the parade. And as someone who's obviously never seen anything like an old person, who's never seen anything outside of what's beautiful and young, he's going to react a lot differently to how you and I would when we come across someone who's, slightly older than us. It really drew him in, and he felt very taken aback by these individuals who looked nothing like what he was used to. So he couldn't stop himself from staring and looking. That pull he had drew him closer to those old men, and he started wandering towards them to see, who they were, what they were doing. In doing so, he came across a group of severely ill people, and it was in this moment he could also see a nearby funeral by the river happening, which was his very first contact to death. So he went to his squire to ask what was going on, what had happened to all of these people, and the squire simply informed him of the simple truths of life, which is everyone gets old, everyone gets sick, and eventually everyone dies. Now, bear in mind, Siddhartha at this point is 29 years old. That's a lot of time he was kept from the simple truths in life. And he told himself he simply couldn't go back to living the way he was and go back to normality, being fully aware that there is a lot of suffering out there. There are a lot of people who are in need, and he wanted to help. He wanted to do something about it. So he simply took off in the night. One evening, late at night, he got up out of bed, he kissed his wife goodbye and crept off and never came back. And at this point, Siddhartha was actually a dad as well. So it meant leaving behind even his son in the night, because he was so determined to, help these people and be of some service to something that he truly didn't really understand at this point. But he was also a very wealthy person. That also didn't mean anything to him anymore. He simply sold his clothes away, cut his hair, and chose basically a life of suffering to get closer to gaining some wisdom. Completely and utterly starve himself to the point where he was almost dead. He was on death's door trying to discover wisdom, freedom, and understand truly what the point of everything was. But in order to discover those things, to discover wisdom, to discover the truth, you've got to have a whole lot of clarity. You've got to have a whole lot of energy. And if this act taught Siddhartha anything, it was that starving yourself just makes you delusional. It loses the clarity in your life. It makes you fill with doubts. So instead, he decided to meet a middle ground, to sit within the middle. Not extreme luxury and wealth like he was used to, not pain and suffering and hunger like he'd put himself through, thinking, the opposite to what he was living was the answer, but instead the middle way, the middle ground. So he could eat, he could drink, and he could bathe again. Now moving forward to him being 35 years old and much, much healthier, Siddhartha decided to come forward to a fig tree, which is a very important part of this story. And this fig tree was where Siddhartha decided he would sit for as long as he needed to until he received the answers to the problems of suffering to come. He sat meditating under that tree for days. And after 6 whole years of Siddhartha trying to discover this truth, trying to find this meaning, it was believed that exactly under that Bodhi tree was where Siddhartha became enlightened. He discovered his truth. He discovered the meaning. He discovered nirvana. It was in that very significant moment there that he became awakened, aka Siddhartha Gautama became Buddha. And you'll remember this from earlier on in this video. This awakened moment, this enlightened moment, was when Siddhartha discovered the 4 noble truths which helped him understand suffering and anxiety. And what's really lovely to me about that is how anyone can achieve that enlightenment. Anyone can be awakened. It doesn't matter on your status, your wealth, your age, your race, country you're in, anyone can reach that. And I think that was evident in the fact that eventually his wife and his father adopted that lifestyle and learnt from his teachings, because he actually taught the 4 noble truths and the 8-fold path, it's called, we'll explain that later as well, to enlightenment. And he gained this community that was taking in all of this knowledge that Siddhartha had discovered, and they began to feel liberated, because that's exactly what the 4 noble truths means. It's called noble because it's about liberating someone from suffering. So, what were these 4 noble truths that Buddha was teaching to his land? Let's dig into that. So the first one is titled Suffering, and that basically covers the ground of the fact that suffering is a matter of fact in our lives. It's the truth of what we will experience from day to day, and it's inevitable. We're going to suffer from time to time, whether that's emotional, physical, what they call background suffering, the inability to accept change. We're going to experience it in our lives. It's just the way of life. But I think in understanding suffering a little bit more, it will help us get through that, and it will help enlighten us. And so the second one is the cause of suffering. And this is basically the idea that we experience suffering through wanting things, through cravings, through the desire to have power or to gain, the idea of gaining too much or wanting to have some kind of self-benefit there. For example, materialistic gains or power. Things happen such as when we don't receive that, when we don't get what we want, afflictions arise, and then it gives us suffering. And we suffer because of our mistaken belief that we are an independent, separate, solid I. And this struggle of trying to maintain this this delusion of ego is known as samsara, or cyclic existence. And that brings us to number 3, which is the end of suffering. And that's the third noble truth, which is basically the idea of stopping yourself from craving things that aren't going to bring about long-term benefit. Realizing that these temporary desires that we have are only going to give us temporary satisfaction, and instead we bring about kind and loving, compassionate thoughts because they will bring us kind and compassionate actions into our life. Having unkind and greedy thoughts to do with cravings and power and materialistic things will yield unpleasant actions in our life. So that's number 3. Moving on to number 4, it's the path. And this goes back to what I mentioned to you earlier about the middle way, which Buddha discovered during his experience after discovering suffering for the first time. So number 4 is basically summarizing the 4 noble truths of realizing that in order to deal with suffering and to avoid it as much as possible, we seek what is called the middle way. And that's the eightfold path as well, the other word I mentioned earlier. And that's basically realizing that we have to be in the middle of not being overly indulgent, so not having too much, wanting too much, seeking too much power, materialism, and the other end of the scale being, self-denial, so not allowing us to have the things that we need, the basic functions. It's about listening to our body enough to the point where we're actually giving it what it needs. So although Siddhartha did have an easy life, he was really moved and inspired by suffering and pain around him, and moved away from the comfort of his palace, of his money, of his basically potential to do whatever he wanted, to live in that bubble and live a stress-free life. But instead he decided that that wasn't the way not only his life should be, but life in general should be. He taught the middle way of being in between those two very extremes. As long as everyone can get to that space, it's about no one being up here and nobody being down there. So he spent the rest of his life, 45 years, teaching that idea to the whole of northeast India. And he taught that kind of mindful way of living, I suppose, through meditation, humility, self-denial, and just discussion. And as the years went by, more and more monks would fan out across Asia to teach that way of living. And then eventually Gautama did pass away in the year of 483 BC, and his followers then organized a kind of religious movement. It was actually believed that one of the last things Gautama/Buddha spoke was during a deep meditative state when he was about 80 years old under a group of sala trees, and he uttered the words, "Impermanent are all created things. Strive on with awareness." And speaking of quotes, I think some of the quotes that you've heard that are still very popular from Buddha, I think will resonate a bit more now you've heard the story of Buddha. A lot of these ideas and practices and values speak very closely to manifestation. Everyone and their gran is talking about manifestation at the moment and how we are capable of achieving what we want as long as we stick on a foundational level of gratitude and a positive attitude, and realizing we will get back whatever energy we put out. I suppose the only blurred line there is encouraging the idea of wanting lots of money and possibly wishing for fame and success, and assuming that being grateful and having gratitude in your life will bring about more of that. But I think find contentment where you are. Ultimate happiness is somewhere in the middle. It's not toying with those extremes. Quotes that might be familiar to you that kind of resonate with the story that you can kind of think about in terms of what Buddha was trying to practice and preach is, happiness will never come to those who fail to appreciate what they already have. If we could see the miracle of a single flower clearly, our whole life would change. Work out your own salvation. Do not depend on others. Believe nothing. No matter where you read it or who said it, no matter if I have said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense. Isn't that a beautiful thing? I hate the idea of religion being too focused on God being the high almighty one who has all the answers and knows all the things. I love the idea of your truth, your heart, your soul, your purpose. This is not an idea of there being a God who created us and has created our lives and our future. This is about ourselves creating our future. Buddhists never claim one religion to be better than the other. It's another personal issue I have with a lot of comments I get about what I believe in, and you know, we shouldn't be shutting each other down for their paths. No one is better than the other, and we're all just energy, sources of light in a human form, trying to work things out and trying to find their way. And that's it, full stop. I don't think anyone should come in between you and finding your truth. You will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger. And that goes alongside the idea of meditation and how we can stop, sit and be still for a moment to acknowledge our emotions, why we're feeling them, and how we can do something about it. You know, finding the source of where it came from and acting from a place that's very rational. Every morning we are born again. What we do today is what matters most. Your purpose in life is to find your purpose and give your whole heart and soul to it. That's probably one of my favorites, because the meaning of life is to find your meaning, or the purpose of life is to find your purpose. I think, once again, everyone has their idea of where their energy and their heart source comes from, like where they pick up the most energy, where they find the most buzz, where their passion lies. It's just about connecting to our inner self and our wisdom and knowledge by doing things like meditating and getting involved with our core again that we probably lost around the age of 7 years old. Gripping that, touching that, manipulating it and making it us and making it a reality in our world. The mind is everything. What you think, you become. That goes alongside the idea of manifesting as well, very much so. To keep the body in good health is a duty. Otherwise, we shall not be able to keep our mind strong and clear. So, mind, body, soul. Once those three things are empowered and worked on, I think you've found nirvana. You're in your space of power. And do not dwell on the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. Focus very mindfully on what's happening now. The future is anxiety and the past is depression. I am going to be making a sort of part 2 to this entire origin of Buddha and Buddhist culture. I want to share a little bit about how Buddhism spread across the world. It's now known worldwide, and it's a really interesting story that I want to get into. So let me know if you enjoyed this. Send me a comment, give me a like, subscribe to the channel. Let me know your thoughts on Buddhism. What do you think about the culture, the belief system, the values, the story, how we view Buddhism today, and the idea of it being a very aesthetically pleasing part of a lot of people's lives, but then the idea of moving towards it because it feels appealing to us and it looks empowering, it can actually eventually teach us things like what we've learned today, even if it started from a very ignorant point of view. I will be reading the comments, so thank you very much for watching, guys. Sending loads of love from my house to yours. Goodbye.